In this short video, I'm going to be talking to you about the structure and function of a generalised nerve cell, which is known as a neuron, and the three types of neuron and where they are found. There are three types of neuron: sensory, relay, and motor. The relay neuron is sometimes referred to as an interneuron, depending on where you're reading about it. Sensory neurons carry electrical signals from the receptor to the central nervous system, which is the brain or spinal cord. Relay neurons are found within the brain or spinal cord and coordinate your response. And motor neurons carry electrical signals from your brain or spinal cord to an effector. An effector is either a muscle or a gland, so they cause a response. So, when we think about a muscle, we always say that the muscle contracts and relaxes. And it's going to contract or relax depending on the electrical signals it's receiving from your brain or spinal cord. When we talk about a gland, glands secrete chemicals in response to electrical signals. For instance, they could release a hormone or they could release digestive juices. So just here, there are a few really key terms: sensory relay and motor neuron, the CNS or central nervous system, the effector, the response, contraction and relaxation of a muscle, or secretion of a chemical by a gland. So, what triggers the sensory neuron to send this electrical message to the brain? Any change in an organism's internal or external environment that brings about a response is known as a stimulus. Stimuli act on receptors. Receptors detect the stimulus and transduce this energy into another form. Now, there's a key term there that you might not be familiar with, and that's transduce. Transduction is the conversion of one type of energy into another. For instance, sound waves are converted into electrical energy by the auditory nerve. The way that the inner ear works to generate an electrical signal is fascinating. So we have this sound wave that travels through your pinna, through the outer ear, and then it hits the eardrum. That creates a pressure wave that travels through the fluid of your cochlea, of the inner ear, which then causes an orientation change in your stereocilia, the receptor cells inside your cochlea, and then the movement of those stereocilia generates this electrical signal. Just one more key term before we carry on. So sometimes we can accidentally interchangeably use the words nerve and neuron, but it's really important that we understand the difference between these two words. So, a neuron is a single nerve cell. And whenever we're talking about things on a cellular level, we should be using the term neuron. A nerve is a bundle of neurons. A nerve is the axons of many neuronal cells all bundled together. This is really important just to generally understand how your nervous system works. If you were to imagine that there was just one cell running from your big toe to your spinal cord, and we called that a nerve. We were like, oh, the nerve that runs from our big toe to our spinal cord, and we imagined that as one cell. And then we might think, well, what if that cell died or broke? I wouldn't be able to feel my big toe anymore. But of course, because it's made up of many, many neuronal cells, those neuronal cells can die or be damaged and replaced over time, and you don't lose feeling in your big toe, because a nerve is a bundle of neuronal cells. Okay, so let's have a look at the structure of a generalised neuron. So, a generalised neuron has a cell body which contains all of the organelles we would expect to find in any cell. So it has its nucleus containing the genetic material. It has mitochondria, which convert glucose into usable chemical energy within the cell for the generation of proteins like the neurotransmitters and for the conduction of the electrical impulse, which is known as the action potential down the axon. It has the ribosomes attached to its rough endoplasmic reticulum, which are also important for protein synthesis, synthesis in this case of the neurotransmitter and other cellular contents. It's then got the axon. The axon is the long, thin bit of the cell that we're all familiar with when we think about neurons, and the electrical signal, which from this point forward we're going to call the action potential, because that's the term that we use to describe the electrical signal that is generated and transmitted down neurons. Action potential travels down the axon, and we can see the direction of travel laid out here. Most of the neurons of your peripheral nervous system, i.e. the nerves that are not found in your central nervous system, so your sensory and motor neurons, are surrounded by a myelin sheath. The myelin sheath is made up of Schwann cells. Now, Schwann cells essentially wrap themselves around the axon. And as they wrap themselves around the axon, they provide an insulatory layer. This increases the speed of transmission of the action potential, and it also prevents leakage of ions out of the axon. This leakage of ions part will become important later when you learn more about the transmission and production of the action potential. But let's just think about how these Schwann cells wrap themselves around the myelin sheath. So if we were to imagine that we could cut down the axon so that we could look at it transversely as opposed to longitudinally, which is how we're looking at it here. So we would see the axon as like a circle. If we imagine that we were looking down it, we would then see that the Schwann cell wraps itself around the axon and it's full of fat. And then we would see the nucleus just here on the side. You might think that word Schwann cell is a really weird name. So they're also referred to sometimes as neurolemmacytes, but they were originally named after the German physiologist Theodor Schwann, who first discovered them under the microscope. So we've looked at the importance of the myelin sheath for insulation and increasing the speed of transmission of the action potential. We've looked at the axon, and that's where our action potential will travel down. And we haven't mentioned the dendrites. The dendrites are extensions of the neuron on the cell body, and it's at the dendrite that the cell body receives a chemical message from an adjacent neuron, which will then be converted into an electrical signal, an action potential that will then be transmitted down the axon until it reaches the axon terminal. In the axon terminal, there are vesicles containing a neurotransmitter, and I've just put a few examples of neurotransmitters here: acetylcholine, GABA, serotonin, dopamine. There are many others. The one that you will most commonly talk about in your A-level is acetylcholine. The arrival of the action potential at the axon terminal will trigger these vesicles to move towards and fuse with the presynaptic membrane. When they fuse with the presynaptic membrane, that will release the neurotransmitters into the synaptic cleft, and then they'll diffuse across the synaptic cleft, and when they reach the postsynaptic membrane on the next neuron, that will trigger the production of a new action potential on the next neuron. So that is the basic generalized structure of a neuron. But of course, not all neurons have all of these features, and not all neurons have all of these features in this conformation. So let's just think about what that means for each one. So we're going to just focus for a minute on sensory, relay and motor neurons separately. So if we were to look at how sensory neurons differ from this generalized structure, sensory neurons have their axon, but they have their cell body sticking out of the middle of the cell, and then they have their dendrites and the axon terminals at either end. Motor neurons look just like the generalized neuron, so we can use that as our exemplar for the motor neuron. And relay neurons, which have no visible axons really at all, but they have bunches of dendrites and axon terminals at either end with their cell body in the middle. It's it's really important when we think about neuronal structure that we can see that even though we've drawn these as two-dimensional objects on a page, we know that all these different types of neurons are three-dimensional and they work within our highly complex central nervous system. And so they are able to make connections with hundreds or thousands of other nerve cells. So when we might, for simplicity, draw 1 or 2 or 3 axon terminals or dendrites, we know that in reality there are many hundreds or thousands of these, enabling them to make many different connections within our brain and other parts of our body. So in this video, we have looked at some really key definitions that you need to learn. We've also looked at the structures and functions of the 3 different types of neuron that you also need to learn. And that's it for now. Well done.